We live in an age of political polarization and preference bubbles, of economic change, rising threats, and a rapidly changing world. Canada needs to stay relevant. We need more smart conversations. We need to dive into critical issues and big ideas with passion and unrestrained optimism. I'm Aaron O'Toole. Welcome to the Blue Skies Podcast. Welcome to Blue Skies. I'm Aaron O'Toole, and I'm so happy to be back blue skying issues with you, Blue Sky in Canada. There's been a bit of a hiatus in the podcast, and it's been nice to actually hear from people, both in email and even running into people saying, you haven't done a podcast lately. And so I apologize to the loyal listeners of Blue Skies because travel and busyness means I haven't done one. But what a way to come back. We are facing existential challenges as a country, as a world. Our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, mentioned a rupture in the world order in his famous speech from January this year at Davos. So today we're going to talk about prime ministers, plural, not just the current one, but the past one. And we're really excited to be joined by someone I consider a great Canadian and a friend. J.D.M, James Stewart, has been a teacher for over 30 years, award-winning. He was, when I first encountered his name, J.D.M. Stewart. It was always the three names before the last name. It was usually because he was a prodigious letter writer to the Globe and Mail. But then he went further in 2018 and wrote a book, Being Prime Minister. That was followed up with last year's The Prime Ministers, which he hastily changed to include Mark Carney. His award-winning teaching and writing has been noticed. He's an accomplished speaker, writer, recipient of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Award. Welcome to Blue Skies, J.D.M. Stewart.
Great to be with you, Aaron. I'm pleased to be the guy who gets you back on the air.
Yes, and what a time we're in. You know, as the listeners may know, I was just asked by the Prime Minister to sit on this Canada-U.S. Relations Committee, all parties represented, industry sectors, because we're facing this challenge for Canada. The order we're used to, trade with the U.S., continental security with the U.S., a strong NATO, seems to be in upheaval. So this is a time where I think more and more Canadians have to start understanding and appreciating their history better. And you do this so well. So your book last year, which has already sold out its first run, it's now in second printing run for Being Prime Minister. Hold that book up. You've got one nearby, I hope.
I do.
You can show people, available at finer bookstores near you.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write a book on Canada's prime ministers?
Well, I think first of all, the fact that I spent a life teaching kids Canadian history was the number one reason why I wrote this book. And there was also a specific moment that occurred when I was speaking in front of a model United Nations group a few years ago. And these are usually the more engaged high school students. And I was speaking to them and I had a picture of Lester B. Pearson on my screen. And underneath it said Lester B. Pearson, and I said to the gathering of high school students, I said, who is this on my screen? And nobody knew who Lester B. Pearson was. So I thought, that's a bit of a shame. And I said to the teacher afterward, I said, I'm kind of surprised that nobody knew who Lester B. Pearson was. We're at a model United Nations thing. And she said, no one really teaches about prime ministers anymore. And I went, well, okay, I really don't want to hear that. And so I thought, I've got to do something about this because I can look after things in my own classroom, but I felt that there was a lack of appreciation of Canadian political history, prime ministers in particular. There hadn't been a book written about prime ministers for more than 25 years, and it's been a pet interest of mine for most of my adult life. And so I said, I'm going to be the guy who writes a new book about prime ministers and brings a new audience to the history of prime ministers. And hopefully I've been successful with this book because I've tried to include other things as well, Aaron. It's not just the straight up politics in the book. I've added in dimensions that haven't been covered in previous books, for example, prime ministers and their Indigenous policy. That hasn't been in any previous works on prime ministers. I've included pieces about prime ministers and environmental policy because we've had a lot of people wouldn't think about it off the top of their head, but from Sir John A. Macdonald, who created the first national park, up to Mark Carney, prime ministers have had to deal with the environment. So I've tried to bring a new twist on things, a new interpretation for 2025, and I'm getting really good feedback on the book, so I'm quite happy with it.
That is fascinating, and that Mali United Nations story is depressing. Here's our prime minister who, as a diplomat, senior diplomat, helped create the rules-based order with the United Nations itself. And
that's right,
and
won a Nobel Prize.
And won a Nobel Prize. They probably thought Pearson was, isn't that the airport?
Yeah.
So good for you. I'm going to probe on that. If we're not teaching it, or haven't been in the last few decades, how have history teachers responded to your work? Are you finding that some of them are incorporating it into their teaching? Obviously there's a high school history component in Ontario at least, and usually schools do a civics in around grade 5. I used to speak to those classes as well. Are you getting uptake from teachers, and is this a resource that people have been kind of crying out for?
I wouldn't say that anyone's been crying out for it. I'd say the biggest response I have got is from the lay public, fully educated people who were looking for a refresher in Canadian history. And this book touches on a lot of the great themes since 1867. Teachers, obviously some really appreciate it for sure, but there's a lot to be done in a history classroom, and I think it's important for everyone to understand that Canadian history isn't just about the political leaders. There's a lot of curriculum expectations that you have to touch on, and so I am working with the Ontario History and Social Science Teachers Association to try to get this book visible to teachers, because it would be a very useful primer for a teacher to have on his or her desk. And I also specifically paid some money out of my own pocket to make a rich and robust index at the back of the book. So I've got a 17-page index, which is very useful for students, very useful for teachers trying to prepare lessons and go where they need to go in the book, and also very useful for journalists to be able to use this as a resource too. So I'm still working with teachers trying to get that penetrate in there, because over time I would say, like that woman who said to me, we don't really teach prime ministers anymore. There is a bit of, I wouldn't call it a backlash, but I would say there has been a turn of focus away from history from the top down, if you will, prime ministers, and more a history to try to be incorporating, I'll call it social history as a shorthand. And there's been a resistance to, well, why would I teach about prime ministers when it's just a bunch of dead white guys? Well, my argument to that is, we can't change the past. Those were the prime ministers as they were, and those decisions that they made have had tremendous impact on the life of the country, for not just at the political level, but at the level of the average citizen. If you look at tax policy or environmental policy, whatever it is, all those decisions from leaders have an impact. And I'll just give you one great quote that I really love from my introduction, which is from Peter C. Newman, the great political writer and journalist, who said, an hour in the office of the prime minister is an hour in the history of the country. And I firmly believe that. And that's why this kind of a book is really important. And, you don't have to teach about every prime minister, but we need to incorporate them in a considerable way as we go through the history of Canada when you're trying to teach students about our past.
Well, let's make this slightly less than an hour podcast interesting to show that, hey, these dead old white guys are interesting and did some interesting things. Of the prime ministers you wrote on, which prime minister, in your view, is underappreciated, especially today, and why? Having looked at all of them, do you think they should be known a little better?
Yeah, I think my answer to that is Louis Saint Laurent. And people who know political history of Canada really well probably would say, oh, he's not underrated. He did so much. But he did do so much, but he's not really well known. And I would say he probably rarely makes an appearance in a grade 10 Canadian history class in Ontario. And he's sometimes called the forgotten prime minister. And that may be partly because of the smoothness with which he governed during the period from 1948 to 1957. It may also be the fact that his personality was kind of patrician and straightforward. He wasn't a dynamic personality, but he was a lovely gentleman, and he got the nickname Uncle Louis, which some of your listeners may have heard before, because of his avuncular style. He loved children, children loved him. He was a pure gentleman, and I think a noble person with a great set of ethics and a way of governing. But he brought in big ticket items. And when we talk about national projects today, the Prime Minister is looking for a number of them. The St. Lawrence Seaway was a project that began under him, although it should be noted, and this is in my book, that R.B. Bennett signed a treaty with the United States in the 1930s to start a St. Lawrence Seaway, but the Senate defeated the treaty. So it never happened until Saint Laurent got things going with Harry Truman, I think it was, and Eisenhower. So those are big projects. Also interesting from today's perspective, Aaron, and this is why we see why Louis Saint Laurent is so important. He increased military spending. I think at one point it was 8% of GDP. So yes, this was in the Cold War era, but he knew that there had to be some military force behind the soft power that he was trying to make Canada play on the world stage. So that's a long answer, but it just shows the importance of Louis Saint Laurent. But he doesn't get talked about a lot, doesn't get invoked in a lot of speeches, even by the Liberal Party, strangely enough, because he was one of our more successful prime ministers.
It's interesting you say that, because I didn't know which you were going to choose in advance, but I often talk about how critical Saint Laurent was, particularly for NATO, and early on the failing of the United Nations because of the veto structure and the Cold War meant that Saint Laurent gave a speech in the United Nations talking about the challenges of the structure when the Cold War was causing the vetoes, and that the Western Alliance needed NATO. 8%, some people are scratching their head at the 5% that we're now signed on to by 2033. But if you think about it, at that time, there was no public health care system, there was no Canada pension plan, there was a hodgepodge of some old age pensions and some veterans benefits, but there wasn't a big administrative and social state of the government at that point, and defense and borders were probably the primary thing that federal government did. Talk about, I've often heard this story, and you can confirm it, putting you on the spot. Maybe it's in an anecdote, but this famous story about John Turner saving Diefenbaker from drowning. Is that a real story? And are there other sort of funny historical oddities about our prime minister that you think Canadians would appreciate?
That is a true story. I think it was in Bahamas when John Turner rescued John Diefenbaker there, and there are a lot of great anecdotes about prime ministers, and I love. There's a lot of great golf stories between Jean Chrétien and Bill Clinton. I guess one time they were golfing. It may have been in Mont Tremblant, and it was getting dark, but they wouldn't quit. So the security vehicles turned their headlights on so that they could golf the final couple of holes by the lights of the security vehicles. And then I remember they were golfing in December one time in Washington, I think, and Chrétien was just wearing a sweater and a coat because it was kind of chilly out, but Bill Clinton had 3 jackets on because he's not used to the cold, and then he invites him back to the White House afterwards to help decorate the Christmas tree. And there's a great story about Louis Saint Laurent as well that I would love to tell, because it just speaks to the humanity of the man. And I think most of our prime ministers have had a fairly strong dose of humanity, and I think it's an essential skill for managing a cabinet, managing a country, and having empathy. And we even see that with Prime Minister Mark Carney, particularly when he's talking about emotional things like shootings and things like this. It really touches him. But Saint Laurent, he was first Prime Minister, and he's coming out to the elevator at the House of Commons, and the elevator operator is there, and Saint Laurent says to him, it was probably 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. He's like, "What are you still doing here?" He says, "Well, I go home when you go home, Prime Minister." He says, No. I can operate this elevator by myself. From this day forward, you go home when everyone else goes home at the end of the regular workday." So it just speaks about his manner of being a human, and I've always liked that anecdote about Louis Saint Laurent.
No, these are the things that I think personalize our leaders, and I've really not appreciated in recent years where you get a snapshot of one aspect of a leader's life and very little else. Whether we've seen that with Sir John A. Macdonald or others, and that's probably a perfect time to segue into the meatier part of the podcast, which is how do we properly reconcile our past and our present? And it seems like we are emerging from the post-COVID, post sort of identity politics awakening, and communities that took down Sir John A. Macdonald statues are now in some cases reconsidering, whether that's Kingston, whether it's the plinth in Montreal. We still have a statue, a pillar to Nelson in Montreal, but
right.
Plinth with Sir John A.'s name is empty.
I know.
Pulled down by a mob. And, when I go to Ottawa, which I've been going a bit recently, there used to be that lovely statue of Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir Wilfrid Laurier sitting, or maybe it was George Brown, I think, sitting on the bench in the luggage area of the terminal where you got
right.
I don't know if you remember that. That quietly disappeared. No fanfare. How do we reconcile these things? And do you see the pendulum swinging back somewhat, where we realized you can't just say Sir John A. Macdonald was about the sad chapter of residential schools when he created the modern country we know today? What are your thoughts on resurrecting Sir John A. Macdonald?
It's hard for people to put aside their values of today because we all feel them very strongly. But the historian's job is to try to look dispassionately at the past and look at those times for the way those times were and not impose our own feelings about things. So we might be very regretful about our treatment of Indigenous people for many decades in Canadian history. Not just the time of Sir John A. Macdonald, but a lot of people get really passionate and want to settle scores that they feel really upset about today by taking it out on figures from the past, and that's not really good history. So to some degree, that shift is happening. We've seen the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald be unboxed on Queen's Park in front of the Ontario Legislature in Toronto. They are bringing back statues, including Sir John A. Macdonald, in Wilmot Township near Kitchener. But on the other hand, I was actually speaking at a council meeting in Prince Edward County this week, where they were debating whether they might bring back the Sir John A. Macdonald statue in Picton. And there was quite a vocal group of activists that came out to that meeting and spoke very passionately, although I would say fairly misinformed, on the issue of Sir John A. Macdonald. And the motion to bring back the statue was defeated 8-6 in the Prince Edward County Council meeting just this week. So there still is a small but vocal minority that will rise up to fight this. But I would say people just don't want to take the time to understand the complexity of history. And I've often likened it to a family relationship or somebody that you know. You can't make a decision about who they are or what their legacy is from just scraping the surface. You've got to really get to know a person in order to really understand who they are. And it's the same in history. You need to spend a lot of time to dig in and find out what a person's historical legacy is. And at the same time, you have to be willing to entertain more than one thought at the same time. So many historical figures have done some great things, but others at the same time have had failures. But we tend to only focus on the failures in recent historical evaluations, and I think that is what's been happening with Sir John A. Macdonald, because he's not meant to be responsible for all of the tragedies of the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of blame to go around for many decades, and I think that it's very easy just to pin it on one person. That's the easy way out. It's much more challenging to try to see how complex this whole issue is, and unfortunately for Macdonald, we live in an age where we don't have a lot of attention span to go and do a deep dive on things, and we also like to be able to, everything's a nail. I got a hammer and everything's a nail, and we're just going to bang on it. And I think that's unfortunate. And what I tried to do in my book, Aaron, was give a very balanced portrait of Sir John A. Macdonald. And a lot of people have emailed me out of the blue and said how they've appreciated it. And, Margaret Macmillan, the great Canadian historian, said on a podcast with The Hub, she said, when we do history as a prosecution, that's not history. When we do history as a defense, that's not history. What we need to do is see history in the round. And by that, I think she means we need to see the full picture and make an evaluation then. And we haven't been doing that, which is unfortunate. I think a lot of the emotion has come out of it, so we're probably capable of having that dialogue, but it doesn't seem to always be that people want to participate in those kinds of conversations.
Well said. History in the round, I really, really like and appreciate that. And as you said, distilling our founding prime minister's career down to some terrible comments he made in the House of Commons and some misguided and hurtful, deeply policies, narrows that down to the prosecution, as you said. And it misses the humanity of the man and a leader who had vision and also had tragedy and was flawed. I used to say when the cancel culture debate was coming up, and most of the time I felt I did a good job representing it. Sometimes I stepped outside of bounds a few times in relation to Ryerson in particular, but I always tried to have a balanced discussion about it. So let's do a bit of a round on Sir John A. Macdonald, James. The man was flawed, but he also had vision. He had tragedy. What is something that I think you could share with our listeners that humanize Sir John A. Macdonald at this time? We're just starting to revisit that legacy and correct the cancellations of him in some cases.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't want to see the human side of these folks because it actually kind of undercuts their argument if you're trying to portray Sir John A. Macdonald as an evil menace or a killer, which he was neither of those things. Why would you want to hear about the tragedy of losing his first wife, and why would you want to hear about his he lost a child in childbirth, and his daughter was mentally handicapped? But yet he was an extremely devoted father. He entertained Indigenous leaders at his home in Ottawa at Earnscliffe and asked one of them, Star Blanket, if he would give an Indigenous name to his daughter, which Star Blanket did do. He gave her the name Star from his name, Star Blanket. And so Macdonald also, people actually loved Sir John A. Macdonald. Of course, we're not saying universally loved 100%. Obviously, there were people who were detractors of his, but he was genuinely liked and respected. He was the kind of guy who would know your name and who would slap you on the back and ask how so-and-so was doing back in your constituency. So, and he also recognized, if we're talking about Indigenous people, yes, we don't like residential schools, and he said some things that we wouldn't appreciate in the House of Commons today. But he also said things like, Indigenous people are the first people of this country, and one day I hope that they will have a member here in the House of Commons. In fact, there was an 1885 franchise bill that did pass in the House of Commons, in which the right to vote was given to Indigenous peoples who lived east of Manitoba, property-owning Indigenous people. And so this was something that never gets talked about in public debates. And in Richard Gwynn's biography of Sir John A. Macdonald, he makes a strong point for this and says, look, this never gets talked about. It's a little known bit of history, but he tried to give the vote to some Indigenous people. And nobody's trying to say that means we're erasing all the things of his Indigenous policy that we didn't like. We're not saying that. What we're saying is there's a fuller picture here. And I think the human way is to look at the whole picture of a person's legacy and be able to entertain two ideas at the same time. And Macdonald can have done policies that we don't like, and we really regret them, and some of them were cruel. But at the same time, it was a different period in the 1880s, and there's more to Macdonald than just that. Yeah,
well said. And before we close on Sir John A. Macdonald, he helped forge the national vision. He superimposed himself on the meeting of the maritime provinces who were talking maritime union, and then asked them to think bigger, talked about the railway and the Dominion, and started establishing a national policy so that the natural north-south trade with the Americans was restricted, so we could build up commerce between the provinces. Is there anything Prime Minister Carney today and parliamentarians today could learn from Sir John A. Macdonald as our first great patriot at a time where the Canadian identity and our prosperity is being challenged? Any of those lessons that we can learn and take in our negotiations with the Trump administration?
I think it's to be steadfast in your belief, and I think we saw a little bit of that from the Prime Minister. I think it was in the press conference on today's April 24th. So I think it was on April 22nd when he said, "Oh, do you know what's irritating is 50% tariffs on lumber, 50% tariffs on steel." So he's pushing back a little bit, and I think all prime ministers always know that it is important to push back at the right time against the United States, and Macdonald would push back at the right time. But he had a compelling vision for Canada, and all of our prime ministers, some more successful than others, have understood that negotiating in that relationship with the United States is it can be a challenging one, because there is a default mechanism for Canadians to be anti-American for the most part, and there's historical and immigration reasons for that. And so prime ministers don't want to seem to be too cozy with the president, and they don't want to be sabotaging sabotaging the relationship. So my advice to the prime minister would be to be steadfast and know who sent you to Ottawa, and that there is an importance to standing up for Canada for sure.
The first great patriot, the old chieftain, has lessons for us today.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go now to the Prime Minister that is my favorite, James, Sir Robert Borden. I think an underappreciated leader, given the tensions a young country had in World War I. But here, for the Blue Skies nerds out there that listen to all my stuff, and thank you for doing that, I quoted Sir Robert Borden in my first English response as a member of the government, as the new Minister of Veterans Affairs, because there was a lawsuit called the Equitas lawsuit by veterans that was based in large part on a quote that Prime Minister Borden said related to the sacred obligation we have to our veterans. As you know, he visited injured Canadians in hospitals while he was in London for imperial conferences. And then in my final speech in the House of Commons, I quoted Borden as well, which you footnote in your book, about we're squabbling too much on social media and not debating our great national purpose. I still think that's the case most days in the House of Commons. Tell us a little bit about Borden and the country he was leading and the union government he forged, and what we might be able to learn from his lesson at a time we need more unity in this country with potential secession movements in different parts of the country. How can we learn from Borden in today's context?
Well, I love that you said he's your favorite, because there's a moment I quote in the book where Jack Granatstein and Graham Rollison write in their book called The Canadian 100, the top 100 Canadians of the 20th century. And in their little chapter on Robert Borden, they say, there's probably not 1 in 1,000 Canadians who would recognize Robert Borden today. And that's unfortunate, because he was a very significant prime minister in Canadian history. And what I've always liked about Borden was he had this profound dedication to a cause. And the cause was not just the First World War, but when he went to visit the soldiers, as you mentioned, he saw the sacrifice that the young men were making, and he said, I'm not going to let your sacrifice go down and be in vain. And so then he returned and decided, basically winning the war and Canada's contribution was going to be the cause of his life. And he almost killed himself being prime minister during that extremely stressful time of the Great War. And I think that sober dedication to the job is something that we can all learn from. And also, Borden was very steadfast in the idea that the British Empire recognized the effort that Canada had put forward during the war, and he never lost sight of that. And when I was saying earlier that he almost killed himself doing the job, I guess it was in 1919. It might have been early 1920. He went to see his doctor because he had had a number of days where he was ordered to stay in bed because he was basically having a nervous breakdown. And the doctor said, look, you can either stop being prime minister or you're going to be dead in 6 months. So he retired from being prime minister and went on a 6-month vacation and then came back 1920, and then Arthur Meehan became prime minister. But, to sum that up, there's a dedication to the job that Borden brought, and I think there was a sense of duty, and I think that's what you were getting at with your quotation about the importance of sticking by our soldiers and the somber sacrifice. And I remember I used to quote one of his speeches when I would give the Remembrance Day address at Bishop Strachan School where I taught, and there was a line about, he would say, these guys are all fighting over there, but you're at home here, and what is your legacy going to be? To carry on what they're fighting for. So he was passing the torch to Canadians and saying, you have a responsibility as well, a sacred obligation, like I think you were referring to carry on what these soldiers want us to be as a country. So we all have an obligation to carry on what other people have built for us. And I think we've lost sight of that a little bit as a country. And when we know our history a little bit more, we've become a little bit more patriotic and proud of what the country has achieved.
Well said, and that's a perfect segue from Sir Robert Borden into this issue about our identity, our culture, social cohesion, and how if you don't understand your past, and if you don't have any affinity to the country and its roots and its origins, would young people step up to fight for it today? Would we come together to help the less fortunate if there was calamity? It's this social cohesion that I worry social media is kind of breaking up a little bit. Talk about how, both in your teaching, and I've encountered a few students of yours over the years. In fact, you had a call with one of them who I think interviewed me. So you were that teacher going above and beyond. How can history bring us together? And is it time to start having more books and lectures and events related to not just the dead white guys, but a whole range of characters, Indigenous leaders, people from our history that we need to appreciate better?
Yeah, I think that is there's always the moment to be talking about Canadian history, because that's how you try to understand who you are as a country. I think the Massey Commission, which was appointed in 1949 by Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, there's his name coming up again, but he was concerned about Canadian culture and the incursion of American culture, because it was really dominating Canadian culture at the time, as it really still does today. But the Massey Commission, when it filed its report in 1951, said that it is imperative that a country know its own stories, its national achievements, and traditions. And that was as true in 1951 as it is today. And I think we need to, when we talk about national projects, a lot of those are really infrastructure based. Okay, that's great. But things like the arts and publishing and books are essential to constructing a national identity. And we were really good at doing that in the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s. And that's faded in recent decades. And I think if we really want to build a bulwark against American cultural imperialism, if you will, and you want to strengthen Canadian identity, you have to tell your own stories. And in a small country like Canada, where the market is a bit smaller, you do need a bit of government support for those artists to flourish. And I would encourage the government to be thinking about the arts, and in particular books, as one of our cultural national projects to make Canada strong, as the Prime Minister says.
And telling the national story is important. And speaking of prime ministers, it was R.B. Bennett who created what became the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, in the early days, radio with CBC. So CBC is a component, obviously, without getting too political. Canadian stories and Canadian culture is not just the CBC. So you're saying we need to look at books, publishing, sort of cultural sovereignty,
yes,
as part of our social cohesion. If we're not telling our own stories, if we're not nurturing the next J.D.M. Stewart, the next performer on stage at Stratford, if we're not capturing these things, we're just a loose collection of people who happen to be living near each other, and we're not citizens of a shared journey together. Speak about that, because social cohesion, the tribalism we see on social media, can that be calmed, or at least reduced somewhat if students understood their country better and understood one another better through not just teaching of history and more history, but the writing, the plays, the television productions that tell the stories as well.
I think it's really hard, because of the fracturing of those institutions that used to bind us together, CBC being one example, but certainly not the only one, National Film Board being an institution. But it's hard because of the fracturing now, and there isn't the same consensus with among anyone, where we're not getting our news from all the same places. Even a lot of young people aren't really even reading the newspaper or getting their news from places like YouTube and such. But I think education is actually one of the important places where we can continue to put a marker down here. And so we should have some sort of, education is a provincial responsibility. And so we should somehow, though, be talking about how we can be protecting Canadian culture, promoting it, so that giving kids a sense of identity through the curriculum that they experience at school. So when I was a kid in high school, I remember being introduced to Canadian literature, and we all read Robertson Davies, and we might have read Margaret Lawrence. Maybe there was some Mordecai Richler, I don't know. And so I wonder how much Canadian novels are still being taught in Canadian high schools. And further to that, there's also been a movement when Canadian writers are setting their books outside of Canada. And so it doesn't really feel like it's the Canadian experience when you're reading a book that's not set in, St. John's, Newfoundland, or somewhere in Alberta. So we need to be doing an audit of what's happening in subjects like in the humanities. I think that's really important. And And in science, one great example that we could all be capitalizing on is Jeremy Hansen going into space. And that's a great Canadian achievement. And I hope a lot of science teachers were talking about Jeremy Hansen, because, you know, we're in one of the we're in a unique position as Canada, where, as they used to say on the CBC series, Canada People's History, which, by the way, they won't show anymore because they think it's outdated. That's another story altogether. But they said geography is destiny. And there's no country like Canada where we share a language with the United States, although let's not forget that we also have a sizable chunk of our population that is French speaking. But we share this language, so they also happen to be the biggest manufacturer of cultural products in the world. So we're fighting against that. And we have to have an awakening that is there to remind us that we have our own identity and stories. But if you don't nurture them, they can disappear. And that's always been one of the threats to Canada ever since radio came in the 1920s.
You spoke a bit about American cultural imperialism, you know, the most voracious and energetic cultural industries in Hollywood and Silicon Valley. And we're here trying to tell our own stories amid that flood of product and information. A few summers ago, my daughter and I both read the book Station 11 by Canadian author Emily St. John about a pandemic and then a Shakespearean arts group amidst the post-apocalyptic world. We loved the book because it was based in Toronto, and it was amazing to read about streets and areas we knew. But then when we watched the Amazon Prime streaming version of the book, it was Chicago, right? So what can we do to make sure that our Canadian storytellers, the creative people we create in this great country, tell the stories, base them here, and help tell the world who Canadians are? I, like you, think there's a role for government without impinging on freedom of speech, without curtailing creativity, but there's got to be a way that we can support people like yours. So your book is already in its second run because more people bought it than the publisher first anticipated. Tell me, are you seeing a bit of a resurgence in interest in Canadian history? Is there a bit of a, time when we're worried about our future and identity, that people are looking to the past?
I think it's still an uphill battle, to be honest, and that doesn't mean that you give up. I think you still have to fight in order to get Canadian history in the mainstream, or get people buying those books and understanding their history. But it's always, I've been following this kind of story for 30 years. The fight to get Canadian history better understood, taught more in schools, and supported from government. And we've made some progress for sure. But definitely the clashing with the United States right now has forced us at least to have a conversation about where we've come from and what is our identity. But I wonder about the staying power of that. People are talking about elbows up, and I haven't seen like a resurgence of Canadian books on the bestseller lists. Part of that is systemic because the whole publishing system has been turned upside down, and really only 5% of Canadian books are sold are by Canadians. So I think we just need a little bit of the poke needs to come from the government in terms of reminding us that we actually have these things, and also to enable Canadian writers to be successful financially, because it's a tough road to hoe there. So there's I'd say there's a glimmer of hope, but that the battle is still to be fought for quite a while, because it's an uphill battle, as it has been for a long time. But we have to stay the course, and that's how I feel about it.
Well, unless your book is a fictional book about a gay hockey romance, heated rivalry, because they're actually all over the bestsellers.
Oh my God, it's unbelievable, right? It's just
from Halifax. Yeah. Although, shout out to my friend Jennifer Chevalier, who's a producer for CBC The House. Her book, The Winter Witch, made a great historical fiction.
New France, isn't it? Like 17th century New France.
Yeah. there are these great stories being told.
Yes.
We just have to cultivate it a bit
Yep.
more. And I love that glimmer of hope. I'll take a glimmer of hope in this world, James, any day. So what do you have next on the agenda? You know, given you've written the Prime Minister, I'm assuming your next book is The Opposition Leaders.
You know, I do have some book ideas, and I've been trying to decide if I write another book about prime ministers, I might get stamped as only a prime minister writer. And so I was considering a book about a gold medalist from the 1928 Olympics named Ethel Catherwood, who was known as the most photographed woman at the Olympic Games, and then she kind of disappeared and became a recluse. So there could be a sports book, because it seems that sports books are ones that definitely sell on the list. So we'll see. There's definitely going to be some writing projects still coming from me, and I won't be turning my back on Canadian history, because it's basically been the cause of my life. And on the back of I have little bookmarks that I give out with my book, and on the back is my favorite quotation from Wilfrid Laurier, and he said, "Canada has been the inspiration of my life." And that's kind of how I've lived my life since I was in high school. I just had this awakening of Canadian patriotism, and spent all of my adult life advocating for and thinking about and teaching Canadian history. So that will always be in the mix for me as I move into the next phase of my professional career.
Canada first, Canada last, Canada
Exactly,
always.
yeah.
You're a great patriot, J.D.M. Stewart. The great RMC grad, Jack Granatstein, wrote a book, Who Killed Canadian History.
Yeah.
I think we should write one on who saved Canadian history, and I think your name is near the top. So thank you for this book. If you loved what we were talking about, check out the Prime Minister's, J.D.M's book. The second run is about to hit bookstores again, because the books are in Halifax. We're tracking it. Support history, support this great country. And today, thank you, James, for blue skying Canada and our prime ministers with us.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been a pleasure. Great conversation about the country and its history, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, and final seed I'll plant is maybe a book is needed on opposition leaders who win the popular vote but don't become prime minister, and it can be a book called Almost Prime
That's
Minister.
right. It's happened a few times. It happens a few times.
Well, listen, thank you, and we'll try and pick up more blue skies. Thank you for listening. Let me know your comments. Share this with a friend. I'm Aaron O'Toole. Thanks for blue skying this with us.